Have you ever noticed that the more you understand the world, the harder it is to live in it? As if seeing too much were a curse disguised as wisdom. It's curious. We grow up believing that understanding is the path to freedom, but no one prepares us for the discomfort of seeing what others cannot. When the mind awakens, it begins to see patterns, subtle lies, illusions that once seemed like truths, and instead of bringing lightness, it sometimes weighs like a stone in the chest. Knowledge, when it arrives, before emotional maturity, becomes a kind of invisible burden, a lucidity that hurts. We live in an era where everyone talks about self-knowledge, but few truly understand what it is and how painful it is to reach it. It requires losing certainties, dismantling old versions of oneself, facing parts we've spent a lifetime trying to hide. It's looking trauma in the eye, raw and naked, and smiling at it. People want to awaken, but they don't want to pay the price of waking up. And that's where the paradox lies. The more you understand life, the more it demands of you. But this process isn't a punishment. It's the beginning of something greater. The pain born from lucidity is the push that leads to transformation. It's what polishes you, teaching you to look at suffering without running from it. Carl Gustav Jung called this individuation, the meeting with the true self. After the fall of illusions, Friedrich Nietzsche saw in this pain the path of strength, the invitation to love one's destiny and say yes, even to the inevitable. And Marie-Louise von Franz completed this circle. It is in the acceptance of pain that the soul finally matures. These three names intersect to reveal the same truth. Understanding is the beginning of a path where suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes a teacher. And those who accept to walk this path discover something few ever find, the peace of someone who has learned to see without breaking inside. There comes a moment in life when something changes and there's no turning back. It's as if the soul awakens from an old dream, and suddenly the world seems sharper and heavier. Jung saw this as an inner birth, the moment when consciousness breaks through the shell of the unconscious and sees what was always there. Beautiful, yes, but no one warns how much it hurts to see too much. The awakening of the mind is a birth, and every light, before it heals, blinds. It's the instant when the old self begins to dissolve, and the question that echoes is, what do I do now with everything I know? Most people think consciousness is synonymous with peace, but in the beginning, it feels more like loss. When the ego faces the truth, it realizes that everything it believed itself to be is collapsing. It's like looking at yourself. After years in darkness, you recognize yourself, and yet you no longer do. Jung explained that this rupture is necessary. Something must die for something more mature to live. But the ego doesn't like to die. It screams, resists, tries to cling to the old comfort of not knowing. It's curious. The more one understands oneself, the more one realizes how trapped one was. Consciousness reveals the invisible chains, the inherited beliefs, social roles, desires that aren't truly yours. It's the sudden clarity that comes after years of not seeing what was around. Suddenly, everything feels wrong, strange, out of place. And at that moment, many confuse awakening with crisis. But deep down, it's the soul trying to reorganize what has always been scattered. It's as if the universe were saying, now that you see, there's no way back. In many cases, awakening begins with something small, a heartbreak, a disappointment in friendship, the exhaustion of living the same job, the same routine, a single conversation. That changes everything. With someone who's already awakened, the person realizes they can no longer live the same way. It's when superficial pleasure too loses its taste and ready-made answers no longer fit. Jung called this a psychic rupture, but perhaps it's fairer to call it a divine invitation. It's life calling out, saying, "Wake up, there's something more." And those who hear this call never sleep the same again. That's the paradox. The more light, the more responsibility. Knowing is no longer enough. One must integrate. And that's where many feel the weight of what they've seen, the loneliness of perceiving what others still don't. The awakening of consciousness doesn't only bring clarity, it also brings the beginning of an inner exile. The soul begins to walk through a territory few can understand, and it is about this exile that the next step of the journey reveals its face. Nietzsche used to provoke by saying that the truth sets you free, but first it isolates, and he was right. When someone awakens to reality, there's no longer a way to fit into the appearances that sustain ordinary coexistence. Lucidity separates, not out of arrogance, but out of sensitivity. It's the price of seeing what many prefer to ignore. Conversations lose their sparkle, shallow bonds dissolve, and the soul begins to feel like a foreigner in its own world. It's a kind of exile that can't be seen, but is felt in every failed attempt to belong. Many confuse this isolation with superiority, but in truth, it's born from empathy. The lucid one sees too much, feels too much, and therefore suffers more. They perceive intentions, repetitions, and the emptiness hidden behind smiles. Nietzsche believed that whoever seeks the truth must bear the weight of being alone, because the crowd is not yet ready to face what they've already perceived. It's an involuntary distancing, not a choice, but a consequence of expanded perception. There comes a point when the world begins to feel too shallow for the depth the mind has reached. Everyday conversations sound mechanical, collective interests seem trivial, and the lucid individual, without realizing it, begins to inhabit a border between the human and the symbolic. They observe, they understand, but can no longer blend in. It's what Nietzsche called the desert of the spirit, the place where the thinker walks alone, yet finds echoes of eternity in their inner silence. Yet there is beauty in this exile. It's where authenticity is born. Far from others' expectations, the individual begins to rebuild themselves, not as others wanted them to be, but as they truly are. Solitude then ceases to be absence and becomes a fertile space for creation. It's where new ideas, understandings, and ways of existing are born. It's the interval between the old and the new, where the being learns to walk without seeking approval, sustained only by their own conviction. But it's also in this desert that many succumb, not from fatigue, but from failing to find the water of knowledge. The soul that sees too much begins to tire, not of life, but of feeling so deeply. The awakened mind seeks refuge, but everything feels insufficient. And it's at this point that knowledge, without balance, begins to drain vital energy, and exhaustion becomes the new form of pain. At a certain stage of consciousness, knowledge stops illuminating and starts to weigh down. Jung saw this as a kind of imbalance of the soul, when the mind understands more than the heart can bear. It's the moment when the individual observes everything, feels everything, and carries within themselves a world that refuses to be silent. What once felt like awakening becomes overload. The person begins to see the causes behind pain, the disguises behind gestures, and ironically, this excess of clarity consumes them. It's the price of seeing too much without having anywhere to rest one's eyes. The lucid mind begins to question its own questioning. Each thought multiplies, generating new interpretations and possibilities. Jung called this ego inflation by light. When knowledge grows faster than the soul can integrate it, it's as if the person becomes a constant observer, incapable of simply being. Everything is analyzed, too interpreted, dissected, and this relentless self-surveillance steals the pleasure of the moment, turning life into a field of endless analysis. This kind of fatigue is treacherous. It doesn't come from physical effort, but from an excess of lucidity. The person who understands too much begins to feel that life has lost its mystery, that nothing surprises them anymore. It's the weariness of someone who sees the game from within and can no longer play it lightly. The world remains the same, but perception changes, and the contrast between what is and what is perceived becomes painful. It's like living in a movie whose ending you already know. Many try to deal with it by seeking distractions, trying to turn off the mind, but soon realize that you can't unsee what has been seen. Jung believed the solution was not to flee from knowledge, but to transform it into experience. In other words, to bring knowledge down from the head into the body, to live it. That's when learning ceases to be theory and becomes something alive. Reading, reflecting, creating, walking, breathing, small practices that help the soul digest the excess of light, because even wisdom needs pauses. And it's precisely at this stage that something new begins to move. When knowledge no longer consoles and the mind feels too heavy, the next step is not to think more, but to feel better. Pain, which once seemed an enemy, begins to reveal itself as a guide. It's the soul saying that the time has come to turn exhaustion into growth. And it's in this transformation where pain ceases to be punishment and becomes a path that the next chapter of the journey begins to unfold. Von Franz saw suffering as a sign that the soul is trying to be born again. When everything begins to fall apart, it isn't punishment, it's a calling. The old identity breaks apart to make room for something truer. Pain acts as a silent master that teaches without words, demanding surrender. It's in this confrontation that consciousness matures, when one stops running away and begins to listen to what their own pain is trying to say. It's the moment when suffering ceases to be an enemy and becomes a kind of translator of what needs to change. The curious thing is that most of the time, we try to cover up pain instead of understanding it. We run toward distractions, seek quick answers, and believe that moving on is the same as healing. But von Franz showed that healing only happens when pain is consciously crossed. It's like crossing a dark river. You feel fear, you feel cold, but only upon reaching the other side do you understand why you had to enter. Running away delays, facing it transforms. The soul grows every time we endure the truth without hiding from it. It's like that silly fear we had as children, the fear of drowning when entering the pool, or of falling off the bike, when the training wheels came off. When you master that fear, the satisfaction the truth brings is knowledge sprouting within us. Those who learn to listen to pain discover that it has its own rhythm and language. Sometimes it just wants to be acknowledged. Other times, it asks for change. It can be the end of a relationship, the loss of a job, or an unexplained feeling of emptiness. Every wound carries a message. Something within you needs to be reborn. And when this process is lived with awareness, suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes initiation, a kind of secret rite, marking the beginning of a new cycle. Amid this process, there's always a moment when the individual realizes that pain didn't destroy them, it only reshaped them. What seemed like weakness reveals itself as strength. What seemed like punishment becomes wisdom. It's in this inner rebirth that a different kind of peace emerges. Not the peace of one who avoids suffering, but of one who has understood it. Von Franz said that the soul matures when it can bear the truth without fleeing, and that this is the essence of transformation, the courage to remain present until pain fulfills its purpose. And when that happens, something changes in the way we see the world. The person who once feared suffering begins to see it as a path. Pain is no longer the end, but a means. The gaze becomes more compassionate, more patient, more human. And it's in this new gaze that life begins to bloom again, even in the face of imperfection. The next step, then, is no longer to fight against the inevitable, but to learn to love what is, exactly as it is. Nietzsche believed that the peak of consciousness was not knowledge, but acceptance. He saw wisdom as the art of saying yes to life, not only to its joys, but also to the pains that compose it. It's easy to admire the sunset, but it takes time to learn to admire the storm. True maturity begins when one realizes that pain doesn't need to be conquered, only understood. Amor fati, as he called it, is this love of fate, the willingness to embrace everything that is, even what hurts. It's the moment when the soul stops resisting and begins to flow with life. Many confuse acceptance with giving up, but they're opposites. Giving up is born from helplessness, acceptance from courage. Saying yes to reality is the most revolutionary act there is. It means looking at your own story, the mistakes, the losses, the stumbles, and recognizing that each one shaped who you are now. Nietzsche saw in this a tragic beauty, the awareness that suffering doesn't steal life's meaning, it deepens it. It's in the contrast between pleasure and pain that the human becomes whole. When one reaches this point, they discover that life isn't about eliminating suffering, but about learning to dance with it. There is something profoundly liberating in this, because while suffering is resisted, it dominates. But when it's accepted, it loses its power. It's like learning to listen to a sad song until you realize that somehow it's also beautiful. What once seemed like punishment becomes expression. What once was weight becomes understanding. And that's how the lucid individual begins to smile, even in the face of the inevitable. The acceptance of the tragic is what transforms the way we see our own existence. The person stops fighting against the flow and begins to walk with it, understanding that pain and pleasure are part of the same dance. It's the point where the mind ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a space of understanding. Nietzsche saw in this the true triumph of consciousness, the ability to find beauty in the inevitable, meaning in the absurd, and lightness in what once seemed impossible to bear. And when this vision matures, a new kind of serenity is born. Life ceases to be divided between what is good and what is bad, and comes to be seen as a coherent whole. Suffering ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a passage, a bridge between who we were and who we are becoming. And it's when that bridge is crossed that something rare arises, the peace of one who has seen too much, yet still chooses to keep loving the world. After passing through pain, isolation, and the weight of knowledge, something begins to settle within the individual. It's as if the soul, tired of fighting, finally sat down by the side of its own path and took a breath. Jung said that true consciousness is born when the ego and the unconscious stop fighting and begin to dialogue. Von Franz added, it's when the soul understands that it no longer needs to choose between light and shadow. Both belong to the same essence. Peace arrives when understanding no longer demands control. What changes is not the world, but the gaze. What once provoked anguish now awakens compassion. People remain the same. Dramas still exist, but the internal reaction transforms. The lucid one learns to observe without getting lost, to feel without sinking. Life ceases to be a sequence of battles and becomes a silent conversation with time. External chaos no longer shakes the center that was built within. The lucid mind finally finds balance between seeing and living. This serenity is not made of passivity, but of maturity. It's the state of one who has understood that not everything needs to be solved. Some things simply need to be understood. The individual who reaches this point no longer seeks certainty, but meaning. They understand that imperfection is part of beauty. That fragility is what gives value to strength. Peace is not the absence of pain, but the harmonious coexistence with the inevitable. It's the rest of someone who has made peace with their own depth. What once hurt now teaches. What once confused now guides. This integration is true spiritual maturity. It's not about being better, but about being whole. Jung saw this as the fulfillment of the mature soul's duty, the moment when the human being accepts the world as it is, and themselves as part of it. It's the encounter with serenity after the storm, and it's here that the journey closes, not as an ending, but as a return to the center. The one who has seen too much discovers that inner silence is no longer emptiness. It is full presence. They understand that living is not about escaping pain, but walking with it. The mind, once restless, becomes an ally of the heart, and what remains is a quiet wisdom, that of one who has understood that life doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful, and that the simple act of continuing is, in itself, a gesture of love. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson of awakening is realizing that lucidity is not the end of pain, but the beginning of wisdom. Understanding too much is not a curse. It's a calling. It's life, asking you to see, feel, and act with more truth. Consciousness, when it matures, ceases to be a burden and becomes direction. And that discomfort that once exhausted you now guides you, because the pain you understand no longer dominates you. It teaches you. So, the question is, what will you do with everything you've seen? Will you hide from what you feel, or will you use it to become someone more whole? Perhaps the answer is not in understanding more, but in living better what you already understand. Because true awakening is not intellectual, it's human. It's when knowledge descends from the mind to the heart and transforms into compassion, presence, and inner freedom. The world remains chaotic. People remain trapped in their distractions, but something has changed. Now you know that you don't need to run away to feel good. You just need to stay, breathe, and keep learning. Consciousness is both the gift and the duty of the mature soul. And living with lucidity is an act of daily courage, the kind of courage that builds inner peace, even when everything outside is still unresolved. If this video touched you in any way, like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to keep diving with me into these themes of mind, pain, consciousness, and self-knowledge. And if you feel like continuing this journey, in the pinned comments, you'll find additional materials, reflections, and readings that go deeper into these themes for those who wish to understand themselves more deeply and know themselves better. Because most people want knowledge, but few can endure what it demands, letting go of who they were to become who they truly are.